agenda, I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/420, a letter dated 2nd May 2021 from the Permanent Representative of China to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2021/10. I now give the floor to His Excellency Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Please.
We've lost the sound.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the important subject of addressing the root causes of conflict while promoting post-pandemic recovery in Africa. Since the start of COVID-19 pandemic, I have warned of the risks it poses to people and societies around the world, especially in countries affected by conflict. The series of policy briefs I issued last year included one that focuses only on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa. This was the backdrop of my appeal for a global ceasefire to enable us to focus on our common enemy, the virus. My call was welcomed by many governments and armed groups, including many in Africa, and is more relevant than ever as we face continued chronic violence in some countries and the re-emergence of old conflicts in others. Violent extremist groups in Western and Central Africa and Mozambique, including those associated with Al-Qaeda and ISIL, have continued and even increased their heinous attacks on civilians, creating additional major challenges for societies and governments. The recent attacks in Cabo Delgado and the increasing insecurity caused by the allied democratic forces in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo are tragic reminders of this serious threat. Since the start of the pandemic, my special representatives and envoys across the continent have stepped up their efforts to enhance conflict prevention and advance peace negotiations in line with the African Union Silencing the Guns initiative. Last month, for example, my special representative for Central Africa, François Luceni-Fall, traveled to N'Djamena and met key Chadian and regional stakeholders to promote peaceful, inclusive and consensual processes for a return to constitutional order following the death of President Déby Itno. In Libya, UNSMIL's outreach through virtual meetings with young people and civic leaders was central to our support for the ongoing political dialogue. Throughout the past year, the Peacebuilding Commission has worked closely with the African Union and regional economic communities to create space for national and regional leaders to share their experiences and seek support to build back better from the pandemic. The Peacebuilding Fund has adjusted its work in response to the pandemic to support national crisis management efforts, social cohesion, dialogues and inclusive approaches, and to counter hate speech and disinformation. Mr. President, many communities and countries on the African continent already face a complex peace security environment. Risk factors include long-standing inequalities, poverty and food insecurity, environmental degradation, urbanization and demographic pressures. Climate disruption is a further crisis multiplier. Where climate change dries up rivers, reduces harvests and destroys critical infrastructure, it displaces communities, leaves people susceptible to recruitment by criminal gangs, violent extremists and armed groups, and raises the risk of instability. Some countries are in a vicious cycle in which conflict breeds poverty and fragility, which in turn decrease the resilience of these societies and the prospects for peace. 1 year into COVID-19 pandemic, as we face the possibility of an uneven recovery, it is clear that the crisis is feeding many of these drivers of conflict and instability. The severe economic fallout of the pandemic is already aggravating tensions. Globally, the crisis has pushed an additional estimated 140 million people into extreme poverty. Economic growth on the African continent has slowed, estimated at 3.5% in 2021 compared with 6% globally. And remittances are drying up and debt is mounting. In the name of fighting the crisis, some governments have restricted democratic processes and civic space. In several countries, the pandemic has gone hand in hand with divisive rhetoric, hate speech, incitements to violence and harmful misinformation, which has exacerbated divisions and further eroded trust. The severe impact of the pandemic on young people, especially in Africa, the youngest continent, is contributing to increased risks. Loss of opportunities for education, employment and income drive a sense of alienation, marginalization and mental health stress that can be exploited by criminals and extremists. The pandemic continues to deepen existing gender inequalities. Women account for more than 50% of the low-wage, labor-intense jobs in retail, hospitality and tourism that may never come back as companies embrace automation. COVID-19 threatens hard-won gains on women's full, equal and meaningful participation in all areas of social, economic and political life, including peace processes. And I urge Member States to make proactive efforts to include women and young people when shaping post-pandemic recovery. Guaranteeing equal opportunities, social protection, access to resources and services, and inclusive and meaningful participation in decision-making are not simply moral and legal obligations. They are a necessary condition for countries to exit the conflict trap and get firmly on the pathway to peace and sustainable development. Mr. President, recovery from the pandemic offers an opportunity to address the root causes of conflict, put prevention at the forefront of our efforts, and implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union's Agenda 2063. The entire United Nations system across the African continent is working to support these goals. African governments themselves have shown great commitment to fight the pandemic by establishing an African task force for a unified continent-wide approach. However, limited supply and access to vaccines and insufficient support for the pandemic response are now hampering and delaying the recovery. Out of 1.4 billion doses administered around the world today, only 24 million have reached Africa, less than 2%. Equitable and sustainable vaccine rollout worldwide is the quickest path towards a fast and fair recovery. This requires sharing of doses, removing export restrictions, ramping up local production, and fully funding the ACT Accelerator and its COVAX facility. The United Nations is advocating everywhere for a coordinated global effort on vaccines and for measures to alleviate the debt burden that threatens to cripple the recovery in many low and middle-income developing countries, and particularly in Africa. I welcome the record allocation of special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund. But these must come with a reallocation without additional onus so that liquidity reaches countries that are in need and avoiding additional problems. I also commend the extension of the G20's debt service suspension initiative and the common framework for debt treatments. But eligibility must be prolonged and expanded to all vulnerable developing countries, including middle-income ones, which still borrow at premium rates and risk debt distress. In the longer term, we urgently need to strengthen and reform the international debt architecture. Mr. President, our United Nations country teams and peacekeeping and political missions are working closely with the national governments, with the African Union and regional economic communities and international financial institutions to counter the spread of the virus and put inclusion, resilience and climate action at the forefront of efforts to rebuild economies and societies. In January, I appointed a special coordinator for development in the Sahel. His efforts will address the important nexus between peace, security and development. In Central Africa, we are working with governments and the economic community of Central African states to implement the regional strategy to address the COVID-19 pandemic and its socio-economic impact. Our communications campaigns and peacekeeping missions are helping to address rumors and disinformation. For example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO's radio Okapi is providing factual information about COVID-19 in local languages. Across the continent and around the world, our verified initiative is providing science-based narratives to help people stay safe, stay hopeful, and help one another. Mr. President, the pandemic has shown that we are only as strong as our weakest link and will only achieve recovery in solidarity. A sense of shared vulnerability must translate into common purpose as we strive to overcome fragmentation and nationalism, address the roots, drivers and sources of conflict and crisis, and shape a strong recovery and build a better future for all. No other continent is more important in this effort than Africa, and we rely on the Security Council's support, and I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your briefing. Under your leadership, the UN has maintained close cooperation with the AU and other organizations and played a positive role in addressing African conflicts and promoting development in Africa. China supports the UN in prioritizing Africa in the work of the UN and to better coordinate relevant efforts to support post-COVID reconstruction in Africa. We will now give the floor to President Faki of the African Union Commission, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Security Council. Let me first congratulate you, Mr. President, on assuming the presidency of UN Security Council for the month of May, and thanking you for this opportunity to brief the Council on African concerns and views on this very important subject of addressing the root causes of conflict while promoting post-pandemic recovery in Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic will continue to have a profound impact on the economic and social development of Africa, in particular on affected countries which already have vulnerable socio-economic systems devastated by conflicts and fragile political processes. Indeed, the trends continue to show a rising trajectory in the number of infected people and resulting fatalities. At the beginning of the pandemic, Africa adopted its own strategy to resist to it. African Union Commission, Africa CDC, special envoys, member states synchronized various actions. This quite successful action led to rescue millions of African lives. Today, the biggest challenge Africa is facing is vaccine issue. It is a very big mistake to think that the world may be secure while the African continent is still lacking protection against the virus and its variants. Can we forget that the world is globalized and that the pandemic is profoundly too? On the political front, there have been challenges in sustaining the necessary political processes for implementing transitions and peace agreements on the ground to avoid a collapse of many African nations. The efforts of UNSC and the EUPC need to focus on the conflict-affected countries and continue to encourage and nurture the political processes being undertaken to ensure sustained progress of political transitions and implementation of peace agreements. Sudan, Mali, Libya, and Chad are an example of our deep concerns in the area of transitional processes. On the economic front, slowed economic growth, lower levels of international trade, lower demand of Africa's primary exports, rising external debt, and rising inflation has created an economic situation which will impact negatively on the socio-economic situation in many African countries. In this regard, 20 African countries are facing the risks of collapse because of the burden of debt. This will require new thinking and initiatives aimed at post-pandemic recovery. I would like to stress that an economic recovery strategy focuses more on an economic stimulus and debt restructuring and not on austerity. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, à ce sujet, il s'est tenu hier, 18 mai 2021, à Paris, en France, à l'initiative du président Emmanuel Macron, une importante réunion sur le financement des économies africaines, sommet auquel ont pris part les 5 membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité, les 3 membres africains du Conseil de sécurité, ainsi que le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Les conclusions de ce sommet sont très encourageantes pour faire face à la pandémie, pour ce qui concerne la vaccination ainsi que la fabrication des vaccins en Afrique. Il a été question également de la relance économique du continent africain à travers, entre autres, la mise à disposition des droits de tirage spéciaux du FMI et un soutien conséquent de la Banque mondiale, de la Banque africaine de développement et des autres institutions financières. Au grand mot, les grands remèdes, a-t-on l'habitude de dire. La communauté internationale doit être audacieuse et trouver des solutions innovantes à cette crise
crisis affecting the African continent. The Security Council, guarantor of international peace and security, should be very concerned by this. Ladies and gentlemen, we're all aware that development and security are closely interlinked, and more so today than ever.
And requires immediate attention. The situation is also urgent and requires immediate attention. The global travel bans and the national lockdowns has generated a socio-economic crisis which has led to disruption of economies and affected both the formal and informal employment sectors, leading to massive job losses, rising inflation, and a real deterioration in living standards. With the COVID-19 pandemic, services delivery has been severely impacted, leading to serious threats to livelihoods, which could trigger rising frustration and growing social discontent. The economic consequences of the pandemic on Africa's small and medium enterprises and the informal sector, notably in conflict-affected countries, such as those in transition processes, have resulted in massive job losses, and this is likely to impact on the return to school initiatives, as most parents lack the means to send children to school. The COVID-19 pandemic has also had a devastating impact on the capacities of public hospitals in these countries, endangering the lives of citizens suffering from other chronic diseases. Excellencies, allow me at this stage to emphasize 3 points on which I want to draw your attention. In the immediate term, we need more coordination and consultation on the distribution of vaccines and manufacturing programs. This is of urgent and of immediate concern. The UN and the AU can assist governments of conflict-affected countries in Africa to ensure that existing efforts in the fight against the pandemic are well coordinated, and in particular the financial, technical, and the logistical assistance for provision of vaccines. There is an urgent need to put an end to the vaccine protectionism and vaccine nationalism, threatening to exclude low-income and fragile countries, thus endangering socio-economic recovery of affected African countries. In this regard, I highly commend the African Union leaders' effort by establishing the COVID-19 Response Fund, aiming at raising resources to strengthen